Good morning, everyone. This is Professor Muhammad Farghal. Today I'm going to talk about probably one of the most familiar terms in linguistic circles, what we call context, which is often the solution as well as the culprit for every linguistic argument. So we often attribute some interpretation to context. So most people would invoke this to support their arguments. For example, when it comes to indirectness, is context bound. And context sometimes may not help in finding a solution for a problem. Assuming that someone who has never greeted you all of a sudden greets you in the morning, and you keep wondering what's on her mind. She has never greeted you before, so what's going on? Maybe you spend sleepless nights in order to find some interpretation of her greeting. The Arabs once said, for every situation there is a say. لكل مقام مقال. Which figuratively corresponds to circumstances, alter cases in English. So we are worried about this insofar as human communication is concerned. Traditionally, we have Minsky and Firth, who are concerned about context. And more recently, we have Hymes and Michael Halliday. So if we look at the traditional perspective, we see that it's a three-way distinction. We have context of utterance, context of situation, and context of culture. If we relate this to more familiar terms these days, context of utterance can be equated with linguistic context, or what's more recently called co-text, the surrounding text. That's why it's called the linguistic context, which is very important in interpreting what's going on in discourse. The second type of context is context of situation. Notice that this is a macro kind of thing rather than micro. So here the reference is not only to an utterance, but rather to the social context in which the utterance is said. And here we can equate it with both physical context and psychological context. The physical context involves the people who are engaged in communication, the objects there, all the physical realia there come within the physical context. Chairs, blackboards, what have you. The psychological context here refers to formality, whether it is a formal setting or an informal setting. For example, the classroom versus the corridor, or the mosque versus the yard in front of the mosque, inside the mosque versus outside of the mosque. Okay, they involve two different psychological contexts. One is formal, the other is informal. And a higher level type of context is what's called context of culture. In many cases, you have to look at the culture in order to make sense of some segment in discourse. Now in Jordan, for example, we have people often talking about Duwar al-Rabi', the fourth roundabout in Amman, where demonstrations take place. Now within the Jordanian subculture, this is a semiotic sign. This might not be interpretable by many people outside Jordan. And the problem becomes more complicated if we are talking about foreign cultures rather than within the domain of the Arab culture. 10 Downing Street, for example, referring to the British Prime Minister's office. Again, this is a semiotic sign, and one has to refer to the culture in order to figure out what's meant by 10 Downing Street. Okay, so for a Britisher, this is a familiar semiotic signs. For an outsider, it might not be that familiar. So one has to refer to culture in order to understand such semiotic signs. So these semiotic signs cannot be figured out within the bounds of language. Some reference to culture must be made. Notice that the term context is probably the most familiar buzzword in linguistic circles. And many theorists have used alternative terminology. Some call it discourse situation, some call it speech event. Now, here the reference is not to simply describe a particular utterance, but okay, we know that we have elocutions. Every utterance in communication, whether in spoken communication or in written communication, must have some elocution, some intended meaning. But the reference here is to something more than an elocution. The context in which that utterance is produced or is couched. And that is what many people call speech event rather than speech act. So speech acts join forces in order to create discourse, in order to create social context, in order to create discourse situations. More recently, Hymes in the 80s put forward a very interesting model to capture what we mean by context, because this is a loose kind of term. Most people use it as a cover term without specifically knowing what it refers to, its components. Hymes called his model the speaking model. Speaking, the word speaking. And he assigns one component of context to each letter in the word speaking. S stands for setting and scene. Setting is the physical context. The objects, the people engaged in communication are part of the physical context. The scene has to do with the psychological context, has to do with formality, whether it's a formal situation or an informal situation. whether something is taking, some communication is taking place on the street, for example, or inside the church or inside a classroom. P stands for participants. And we all know that communication must involve two people at least, a producer and a receiver. Now, the identity of the participants is important, makes a lot of difference in defining the kind of language produced, discourse produced. Boss versus secretary. Okay, two different discourses you get from them. Professor versus student. That's that here, distance and power are at work. Sometimes we have equals, classmates communicating with each other. In conversation, we have equals. Power is neutralized. Distance is neutralized as well. So we only have associated discourse taking place between equals, despite the fact that some of them might be PhDs, some might be only, some of them managers, some of them ordinary people. It doesn't really matter so far as it's conversation. So in conversation, we have equals. E, the letter E stands for ends, purposes. Okay, whenever you open your mouth to say something or put pen to paper, then you must have some intentions. You must have some ends, al-ghayat. Are you informing? Are you trying to persuade your listeners of something or your readers? Okay, so every discourse must have some end. And every utterance must have some end. But at the end of the day, we have a discourse. And these elocutions join forces in order to produce discourse. A, for act sequences. The way you go about it. This simply means that you have some end, but you have many means to fulfill your end. It's not, language provides you with many ways to get to your end. You do this by issuing an order, by requesting, by questioning, by going off record. All these are means to get to your end. So at the end of the day, you'll get to your end. So discourses, utterances must have ends, and these ends join forces together in order to produce a discourse. K. K stands for key. Are you serious? Or are you kidding? Do you mean what you say, or do you go beyond what you say? You may say something, but mean the opposite of saying that. Notice that the key is important, and it's there, the tone of discourse, the tone. Okay. Seriousness, the degree of seriousness usually manifests itself in your tone. I, in the word speaking, stands for instrumentalities. Your textual choices. Is it spoken English or written English? It does make a difference. Why? Because the way you speak is not identical to the way you write. When you speak, you have access to non-verbal communication. When you write, you don't have access to non-verbal communication. Even the syntax of what you produce in speaking is different from the syntax of what you produce in writing. Your vocabulary will be different. In speaking, we don't use Latin kind of words, but our writing is often loaded with such words. Subordination, for example, is very common in written discourse, but it's not that common in spoken discourse. Do you choose standard English or vernacular English? Cockney English, for example, or Black American English? Standard Arabic or Jordanian Arabic, for example? Okay, these are two different instrumentalities. Do you choose informative discourse or argumentative discourse? These are instrumentalities as well. Why? Because in informative discourse, your end is to inform. The aim is to inform. But in argumentative discourse, the aim is to persuade rather than to inform. So these are different instrumentalities, spoken versus written discourse, standard versus vernacular discourse, informative versus argumentative discourse, versus expressive discourse. Okay, these are different instrumentalities which define your discourse. The next letter is N, which stands for norms. And norms are strategic in nature here. For example, okay, norms in conversation. We have norms of interruption. When do we interrupt? Do we do this haphazardly? What do you do if you want to take a turn taking? This is strategic. Also, norms have to do with how different genres are produced. For example, the norms when it comes to writing a formal letter versus an informal letter. Writing a letter to your friend is not the same as writing a letter to your manager. So the norms here have their say. And finally, we have the letter G, which stands for genres. At one point in time, when I talked about standards of text or text typologies, I think, yeah, I said that there are two main terms here one is supposed to be more general than the other. We have the term text type and we have the term genre. So every text type is supposed to include many genres. For example, in argumentative discourse, which is a text type, political commentaries are a genre. Professional presentations are a genre. Debates are a genre. And informative discourse. News reporting is a genre. Description is a genre. Analysis, narrating, all these are genres that come under a more general kind of term, text type. This speaking model, as you can see, can define discourse. If we look at any genre, one can analyze it in terms of these components. If we look, for example, at conversation as a genre in spoken discourse, okay, we can analyze this. We can analyze this in terms of the 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, the 8 components, the letters and the word speaking. Setting, for example, and scene. The setting, the corridor, the street, the party. So these are familiar settings for conversations. Scene. The scene is informal. In conversation, we have an informal scene rather than a formal one. The corridor, the party, people just chat with each other, engaging in conversation. Participants. Here we have equals. All interactants in a conversation are treated at an equal footing. Degrees are set aside. Qualifications are set aside. Right? They are not relevant when engaging in conversation. Why? Because in conversation we have equals. Ends. We have, because conversation is associative in nature, we have different ends coming from different individuals engaging in the conversation. Sometimes they agree on common grounds and sometimes they disagree. Okay, so they might have similar ends or different ends. And they might end up not agreeing at all with each other, but okay, they just, it's conversation, all right? So everyone contributes to the conversation in his own way, and some, okay, friction might be created, but not necessarily. Act sequences. Usually we have adjacency pairs, comments, questions, questions, answers, comments, counter comments, etc. and so forth. Why? Because we have, and it's usually right back. Okay, sequences are not highly formal, all right? They are informal, all right? simply because this genre is associative in nature. So we don't, all right, the syntax is rather simple rather than sophisticated. Key. Again, key varies here. Sometimes, all right, some participants might be serious, some might not be serious. All right, so for example, some font might generate some ironical comment from another participant. So again, the fact that it is associative creates room for being both serious and not serious. The tone might change from one participant to another, and this might affect the degree of seriousness. Instrumentalities, spoken communication, and it's usually the vernacular, especially in Arabic, for example. Right? People do not converse using standard Arabic. Even in English, all right, when people engage in conversation, they use vernacular English. And if this is not the case, then someone might, for example, someone might want to signal the fact that he's more educated than the others by using standard English. Yeah, this is quite possible, but generally speaking, it is the vernacular that's used in conversation rather than the standard dialect. Norms, in conversation, people interrupt each other. People take turns. This is not something available when it comes to, for example, lecturing, a presentation. You cannot interrupt the presenter. You'll have to wait till the end of the presentation in order to be able to ask questions. Now, sometimes you might be disappointed because there will be no room for questions. Genres, yeah, this is a genre of spoken discourse. If we look at another genre, a news report, for example, again, we can analyze it in terms of the 8 components. Setting and scene. Note that here we have a formal situation. It's a news report. So you either listen to a news report or read a news report. So we have a formal situation rather than an informal situation, the way it is in conversation. Participants. Okay, we have a producer and we have a readership or an audience. Okay, the producer has power, is informed. And the audience or the readers just receive information from that news report. Ends, okay, the objective is to inform. You are just offering information to people you think need it. Newspapers, for example, news reports, or just the publishing house decides what should be included insofar as news reports are concerned. So the purpose here is to inform. Act sequences. It's usually the indicative mood. All right, you are just informing others of what has happened in Bangladesh, for example, an earthquake that took place in Bangladesh, and the newspaper is reporting on that. There's a news report about it. So it just informs you about the number of casualties, okay, the degree of destruction, etc., and so forth. The measures taken by the government, things like that. So it's informative. So the news report just monitors information and relays it to the audience. Key, serious. Right? A news report is not supposed to be ironic. Okay, the tone must be serious. Why? Because it's a matter of relaying information to others. Just, all right, the producer doesn't want to make a laughing stock out of himself by presenting, okay, something that is obviously false or something that is ironic in nature, or so the tone is neutral. Why? Because a news report is supposed to be serious. Instrumentalities usually it is the written mode, but could be the spoken mode as well. All right. Such when it comes to media. Okay, you can hear a news report on the radio, and news reports are found in newspapers. Norms, yeah, a news report is supposed to be neutral. You are not producing a news report to convince people of something, but rather to inform them of something. So it's not like a commentary. A commentary is there to persuade you of something, but a news report is there to inform you of something rather than persuade you of something. And genres, this is a genre of informative discourse, which can be contrasted with a commentary, which is a genre of argumentative discourse rather than spoken discourse. So the norms are different. In a commentary, you find lots of emotive adjectives. You have lots of dientic modality. But in a news report, okay, the adjectives would be kept to a minimum. And modality would be epistemic rather than dientic. Okay, as you can see, the speaking model is a very interesting model, simply because it unpacks what we mean by discourse. And here the word speaking comes to the help of Hymes. It has 8 letters, and each letter can, in fact, refer to one component of discourse. Look at from a different perspective, but basically it is the same kind of thing, or I just, this simply means that things can be viewed differently in terms of terminology, but when it comes to content, the content might stay constant. And if we look at Michael Halliday's theory of register, and register here can be simply defined as a variety. So according to Halliday, a language variety or a register can be defined in terms of field, tenor, and mode. Field has to do with what the discourse is about, the topic of discourse. Is it sport or linguistics or economics or cooking? Okay. These are different fields, aren't they? So the language used in cooking is different from the language used in, or the register used in cooking is different from the register used in linguistics or the register used in medicine. So this has to do with the field. And at the discourse level, this relates to ideational meaning. Ideational meaning, the fact that in different registers we have different terminologies. The terminology I'm using in this lecture belongs to linguistics. It might not be familiar to someone outside, someone an outsider. An outsider would not probably understand everything I say, simply because I sometimes use technical terms. Transitivity also has to do with ideational meaning. The way you go about your act sequences, like the use of passives versus the use of actives. Okay, this has to do with transitivity, and this may be reflected in different discourses. Mode, or rather tenor, the second defining feature of register. Tenor has to do with interpersonal meaning at discourse level. The identity of the participants. Are we talking about equals or unequals? Boss versus secretary, professor versus student, high-ranking officer versus a recruit. Here, power and distance. Mother-daughter interaction. Okay, tenor, the relation between speaker and hearer in terms of distance and power makes a lot of difference in the nature of discourse produced. In written discourse, tenor may also correlate with the use of emotive adjectives. Being neutral versus being biased. This has to do with tenor, all right? For example, the kind of discourse we find in commentary, a political commentary, is different from the kind of discourse we find in a news report. Why? Because a news report is simply relaying information. It's a matter of monitoring information. Whereas in a political commentary is a matter of manipulating information rather than only monitoring information, managing versus monitoring. These are two important terms. Sometimes we monitor information, and sometimes we manage information. We manipulate information. The use of epistemic versus deontic modality. Notice that deontic modality is more imposing. It's imposing, right? It's not only more imposing, it is imposing, which contrasts with hedging in terms of epistemic modality. This has to do with tenor, argumentative discourse versus informative discourse. Debating, for example. The use of deontic modality in debates. Very obvious. And this creates a lot of turmoil, a lot of fiction, which might lead to what? Some physical friction. They fight sometimes. And the last defining feature, mode, which relates to textual meaning at discourse level. Not that mode here relates to instrumentalities in the speaking model. What instrumentalities you use when you produce discourse? Spoken versus written discourse. Standard versus vernacular. Expressive versus argumentative discourse. These are different modes of discourse. Conversation versus debating. So the mode of discourse has to do with instrumentalities, genres, and nodes. That's that mode here. Mode would reflect many components found in the speaking model. So if we look at both models, Hymes models and Halliday's model, we can see that they overlap. And both of them are meant to unpack what we mean by discourse. All right, so in this lecture, I have shown how loose the term discourse is, and the fact that it's used as a cover term without worrying about what it means or what it exactly means, its components. And these models are meant to show us what components determine what we mean by context. That's it for today, and thank you very much. Goodbye.